Hey guys, welcome to this week's podcast episode. I've got a very fantastic guest for you today, Andrea Johnson, and she is a transformational leadership coach, and she's the founder and CEO of the Intentional Optimist. And what's really interesting is that she's got a background in healthcare, so she can speak the language of healthcare to doctors, professionals, executives. And today's talk is going to be all about intentional optimism, core values, leadership, everything that we need to succeed in today's uncertain healthcare environment. And I'm happy to have her on the show. So, Andrea, welcome.
Thank you, Chris. I'm happy to be here. And as we were discussing earlier, it feels a little bit like home talking to doctors and dentists. And
Yeah. Yeah, I love it when guests can speak the doctor language and kind of get to the audience. It helps connect with the audience and makes for a much more impactful episode. Share your background. I know you shared some earlier on. You're at Hopkins and did grant reviews. So talk about that and how it led to what you're doing now.
sure, I spent 23 years in the schools of medicine, if you want to call it that. When I talk to people outside the medical institutions and community, I have to explain everything. But I spent 11 and a half years at Johns Hopkins in the oncology center. And I spent 11 and a half years at the University of Virginia in this, not entirely in the School of Medicine. Some of it was in the main office for research administration. But I spent my time there on the university side working with physicians and researchers, making sure that they had everything they needed. So I had to learn all about head and neck cancer when I was at Hopkins, and I had to learn what it takes for a doctor to be able to survive in both the research and clinical side of that institution. And then when I moved to the University of Virginia, I dove into research administration and realized I couldn't push papers all day. I needed the interaction with the individuals. And so one of the things that I just loved about doing that work was that I got to help people figure out what made their mission better. And so when you can sit down with a new faculty member or a new MD PhD and say, look, your grant will go through. Let's just make sure that we get all the administrative stuff right. And let's make sure we have the right people in your lab. And then when you work with PhD students and help them graduate and go on to be, I can see them at different organizations as faculty members, or I can see them now as big developers in the pharmaceutical industry. That it is very rewarding to see that. But I figured out that I don't want to manage and I don't want to administrate. I want to help people learn to lead because we need leaders in every area of life. And so that's what I stepped out to do. But my background is most definitely in this area.
Yeah, so beautifully said. And when I was in grad school, and also it was just, we talk about how supportive the environment is so that you can achieve your goals. And so I love when we could talk to staff and get grants through and all that. One thing I have question is this big idea of intentional optimism. And we've all heard of optimism, but what is it and how can one develop in your own life?
So I call intentional optimism how I do what I do. And are you familiar with the Enneagram at all?
Yes.
Chris?
Yeah.
Okay.
The
So
Enneagram.
I am an Enneagram 6, wing 7, counterphobic, I have all of it, right? And what I didn't realize is that I developed 6 tenets of intentional optimism to help me navigate life. And it works for everybody, but when my part of my story is that I lost my mother to breast cancer 7 years ago next week. And being at Johns Hopkins in the oncology center meant that I had access to things that I wouldn't have had access to before. But it doesn't make it easy when you watch someone go like that. But my mother was one of those people that was like a bottle of champagne. She'd walk in a room and it was like on Cheers. People would say, Norm, they'd say Judy. But as I watched her go, I watched her leave with a lot of strength. I watched her leave with hope. I watched her leave without leaving anything unsaid. And I realized I wasn't necessarily living that way. And so I said, I need to figure out why. And so I started writing down, if you've ever been through a period of grief, and if you deal with patients, you're dealing with grief all the time. And I don't know how y'all can go to those mortality and morbidity conferences, but that was always off my plate. I was like, I'm not going to those. But being able to sit down during that period of intense grief when we lost her and say, what's important to me? What do I want to live and represent? And so I came up with 6 tenets after brain dumping everything down and pulling it into a spreadsheet, getting all data oriented, just like, what does the data say? It said that I wanted to be optimistic, but I didn't want to be blind, right? I'm a realist. I can't help but see those things. Anybody in the medical profession understands that. So that's the first tenet, is I choose to be optimistic, even when sometimes it's hard. The second one is being present. And it is so easy in really hard situations to detach yourself, right? How many physicians get in trouble for detaching themselves with a patient when they really need to have really good bedside manner? But so that's the second, is present. And then the third is energetic. Where does my energy go? I want to make sure that I bring enough energy to every situation that I can be present and optimistic. And then the fourth is courageous. We face things every day that are really hard. And this is, the more I talk about it with you as a physician, it sounds really good for physicians. I never thought about it, but it's just being willing to say, I'm going to challenge today, undaunted. I'm going to walk in, I'm going to be resilient. This is where the resilience piece comes in. The fifth one is wise. Anybody who's been through hard stuff has gained wisdom. Anybody who has been around the sun as many times as I have at this age, you gain wisdom. And when we are willing to share that, then we become agents of change in ways that are much quieter and much more longevity producing. Sustainable is a word I would like to use. And then the final one, to bookend it all, is intentionality. And if you don't have a plan, you may not get anywhere. And for anybody who's had several degrees, and if you're a physician, you've been through residency, you've been through medical school, you've been through college. So you know and you know what it's like to have an intentional plan. None of this should be ironclad. It should be like scaffolding. I was raised in Seoul, Korea. My parents were missionaries, and their scaffolding there for high rises, I don't know if it still is, but back when I was there in the 70s and 80s, was bamboo. And it would scare us to death because we're used to seeing that. My grandfather was a steel worker, but to see that scaffolding go up and think, oh my goodness, that could just fall at any moment. But what it does is it gives you the scaffolding that allows you to climb and allows you to build, but it gives you a little bit of flexibility. And so I think that's what I would suggest the tenets of intentional optimism is a scaffolding with flexibility to help you live the way you want to live, to show up in your strengths, to show up in your core values as somebody who can make a difference.
I've really had a lot of the previous guests. They're so eloquent. The guests today are speaking so beautifully and eloquently. And so the next question I have is this idea of, so when you talked about 6 core tenets and how to develop it. So the next question is, you talk about this idea of critical thinking, which is your most effective personal growth skill. But on top of that, you have 3 levels of awareness, A, B's, and C's. You talk about that as it relates to critical thinking.
Yeah. Growing up in Western society, we are, especially now, my son is a freshman in high school. So there's very much this teach to the test and figuring out, it's like, just answer the question. Yes, but, and being willing to teach ourselves, because we may not have been taught how to question everything. I like to say I have terminal curiosity. And it's one of those things that it may have killed the cat, but they had 9 lives to start with. So I'm okay with that. But being willing to say, why do I accept something that comes? We receive messages from all angles and all the time. I don't know the actual number of messages that our brains receive each day, but if we don't take those and filter them in some way, then we have a default way of filtering them, which is what I call our ABCs, our assumptions, our beliefs, and conditioning. But if we don't actually say, what am I doing with that filter? Why is that filter there? Then we're always living on someone else's principles, someone else's priorities, someone else's idea of what's important today, or what I should be concerned about. And as leaders, we can't do that. If you want to run a business, to be a doctor, that's one thing. There's certain, I get the regulations. I get it. But if you want to transition into taking that out to a business that you can run for your own and that you can actually make an impact, you've got to be willing to say, that iceberg model, what are the things that are above the surface that I see that I haven't been paying attention to? And those are my assumptions. I walk into a room and I just assume people are going to like me, or I assume people are not going to like me, or I assume everyone can speak at my level. learning how to do clinical trial documents, I had to drop everything to an 8th grade reading level. And I hadn't been at an 8th grade reading level since I was in 4th grade. So those are assumptions that we have. But then below the surface of the water is where our beliefs start coming in. And understanding that our beliefs are formed by our demographics, our upbringing, our school, our news we listen to, all of it. And then below that is this conditioning that we're really not aware of. That's the big piece of the iceberg that we talk about, white people swimming in white water and not realizing that we're a fish. And being able to say, oh, hang on, just because something's easy for me doesn't mean it's easy for the next person. And so as I start to move forward, I have to make accommodations for how I speak in certain areas to make sure that I'm inclusive with everyone. My son has ADHD, so I have to think differently when I explain something to him. I am conditioned to say, go look it up. That's what I was told. But it's a little bit more of a challenge for him. And so when we start challenging our own beliefs, because beliefs, Chris, are changeable, all of them, 100% of them. The only thing that's really not changeable in you is your core values. Those are the things that you're wired with. Those are the things that matter the most. They drive you, they motivate you. So if you take a look at your beliefs and say, I believe everyone should pull themselves up by their bootstraps, or I believe that I should be able to start a business and have no trouble like so-and-so did, what does that mean? What does it mean from your religious background? So all of these things come into play when you start looking at, okay, I am going to be a leader in my space. I am going to make a difference. And if you're not willing to look at them, you're going to be hamstrung, as I like to say.
Yeah, I love that and how you described just your levels of awareness and consciously. Once you develop this idea of awareness, then you can start to consciously, intentionally formulate a plan for you to succeed. And the other, what we're basically getting down to is coping and emotional resiliency. And so what I'd like to transition, and one thing is talking about is that what kind of, you talk about trials and tribulations and how that has you facing significant challenges and how these experiences contributed to your, excuse me, contribute to your emotional resilience as well as emotional resilience techniques.
Sure. The first thing that I want to say to everybody is that we don't know what we know until we know it. And that's true in any diagnosis. That's true in any research endeavor. And being in a research environment helped me understand that a negative answer is still an answer, right? That's still an answer to a research hypothesis. And even though it's a hard thing, we learn from it. So when I talk about going through trials and tribulations, one of them I already mentioned was we all have hard things, right? So I'm not special. But my mother dying of cancer after 15 years of that and 3 years of lupus before, so all of those things together, growing up overseas sounds like a cakewalk, but it's not for a 7-year-old kid who is tossed into a whole new environment. We see that happening with other kids coming to the United States in a whole new environment. We see it with kids who have different neurodiversity than the norm. But for me, it was things like that. It was things like, and being in Korea during the time when DMZ was always being challenged. And my dad was usually down country somewhere. So it's like me and my mom and my sister. Those things create in you this like anxiety, and just not really having that settled feeling just put that into my system. And I just started living in more of an anxious world. I ended up developing bulimia as early as probably as early as 10. And so I took that on as a coping mechanism, which is not a healthy coping mechanism. But then ended up putting myself in the hospital for bulimia and depression when I was 20. And that was the first time somebody looked at me and said, it's okay to say you can't handle life on life's terms. It's okay to take a minute for yourself and do some mindfulness practices. I'd never even heard of that. And so I learned things like staving off a panic attack with the 5 senses. I see 5 things, I taste 2 things, working your way down. So different coping mechanisms and tactics, but I went through early menopause at 39. And so we ended up adopting my son at 42, which is why he's just a freshman in high school. So we're late parents, then to discover he's ADHD. My grandfather committed suicide. I mean, it's just, he just had kidney failure and he just couldn't take it. And just one thing after another. My husband is a pastor, and we were 18 months into his first pastorate in Baltimore. And I was sat down by a couple of deacons and said, we're going to ask that he gets fired, and it's because of you. And I'm like, what? So when you go through hard things, if you're willing to see them as things that you can learn from, that's how you develop resilience. Resilience is the ability to bounce back from any given circumstance. And it may take you years to bounce back from the first hard thing or from any one hard thing. You might bounce back from one thing easier than another. I just did a conference here. I'm a Maxwell certified leadership trainer and coach. And every year he does a Live to Lead conference. And Ryan Leake was one of our speakers this year. And one of the things he talked about in chasing failure was it's easier to bounce back from a $15, oops, I forgot to turn off that prescription, that subscription, than it is from a $15,000, oops, I shouldn't invest in that. But we learn from all of them. And if we develop a learner attitude, an attitude of, I am always a beginner and I am always learning, then that gives us a leg up and a slight mechanism to cope with some of the difficult things that happen. And I think when it comes to business, putting systems in place, putting people around you that are going to encourage you, getting the right kind of training you need. When you are a doctor, you have to go through all kinds of medical training. And if you're transitioning into business, I have met 2 doctors in my life in 23 years of working with doctors who had good business sense. And both of them also had MBAs. So be willing to get yourself some training because you're not trained for that. And be willing to say, I need some help. So it may be that you need a leadership coach. It may be that you need some business courses or something like that. But when you start looking at these, quote, setbacks or hard things as learning opportunities, that's where your resilience starts to come from.
Very powerful. And as we come to the end of this talk, which I really enjoyed, is talking about DISC. And we've all had our set of trials and tribulation. I've had mine, and it's how one thing I've learned is it's how we perceive things and how we take that as either gifts or lessons and progress, even though it could be very tragic. One thing is talking about, especially in healthcare or organization, is talk about this DISC analysis. And so talk about that briefly and kind of end on how people can find out more about you.
Sure. So as a Maxwell leadership trainer and coach, I'm also a DISC consultant, and DISC is a behavior analysis tool. It is a communication and leadership tool. So when we talk about being in healthcare or being in business, we've got to learn to communicate. It is very common now to have transcribers or translators in the room with you as a physician, but you don't get that when you go into business for yourself. So one of the things that's really powerful is to understand the patterns that you see in other people's communication styles. And so when we talk about DISC, it is a report that you can get from a lot of different places. You could do a free one online, but the report that you get, as it's like when you get data, right? You can get raw data, or you can get interpreted data, or you can get data that's interpreted in specific ways. And the Maxwell report is actually a leadership and communications report. It's 30 pages long, and it gives you all kinds of data that you can then use on an immediate basis and put into play for personal growth and for leadership and for sales or marketing or anything like that. But one of the pieces to understand is that if I start speaking Korean to you, I don't know that you would understand me. And I can do a little bit of it, but it may be that if I speak English, we're both on the same page. So if I know what language I need to speak in for someone so the DISC actually stands for, it's a quadrant, and it stands for, D is for drivers or dominance. These are about 3% of the population. They're your get or done people, results oriented. These are your bullet point people. It's not uncommon to have surgeons be Ds, right? It's just, or ER people, right? It's both, right? But it's all about the results. The I stands for influencer. These are your funny people, your talkative people, they're storytellers. If you know anybody who's a storyteller and relates to people really well, they're probably a high I. That's me. And then they're about 11%. Then the next one around the clock is the S's, which is the steadies. These are 69% of the population. They are the backbone of your organizations, no matter where you are. And these are the ones that on the change curve, they're like on the going down. They don't want to change anything. Steady literally means that. If it ain't broke, why are you fixing it? But understanding that once these people do change, they are going to be loyal to you. They are the one. So whenever I needed to do any change, I would look at my team, because I had at one point over 20 people that I was supervising, from clinical trial people to grant people to administrative assistants. And if I needed to do some change, I'd be like, I know I need to talk to this person and get them on board and let them see the benefits of it, and then let them do the actual talking. Because me as a hype person, I can only cheerlead for so long. I get hoarse. And so when you understand that most of the people are like that, then you can actually communicate that way. And the final one, the C, is your creatives or your compliance. These are the detail people. These are your, like my husband is one of these, either musical people or your accountants, your financial people. But it can also be like, I have an oncologist that I have worked with who is a straight C. Usually we have all of them, and we do to a certain extent, but she represented so high on the C scale. But for her, every single piece of every single patient was detailed out. She wanted to know all of it. So when you know who you're speaking to, that if a C is not asking you questions because they don't trust you, they want the right answer. An I wants to tell you a story, and if you cut them off, you've offended them. And a D just really wants to get out the door. Can we take this? Can we be done with this? Can we make a decision? But if you know those things, it really helps you. So what I do is I offer both just the straight assessment, or I offer individual one-on-one coaching with that. Like I can do a debrief, a 90 minute to a 2 hour debrief to walk through yours personally. I can add coaching on the end of that. But I also do that in organizations. And it's really fun to put an entire team in the room and say, all right, y'all, let's see, these people are this and these people are this. It makes the light bulbs go on. So I have a couple of things that would help out your listeners. I do have one link that is just a free, what I call a disc cheat sheet. And so it's theintentionaloptimist.com is my website. You can find everything there /links. It's going to get me. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Facebook. I'm on YouTube. I have a podcast, Stand Tall and Own It. But if you go to theintentionaloptimist.com /cheat, CHEAT, you will get that ultimate cheat sheet. And what it'll give you is a crosswalk. If you see a person acting like this, they might be a D, and this is how you talk to them, et cetera. It also gives you how to talk to kids. Because if you have children and you're like, I don't know what to do with this kid, it may be that you're speaking different languages. So I have that as something that is easily accessible. But the other thing is I created a special download and a special link for your listeners. Specifically, it's at theintentionaloptimist.com /financial freedom. And because that's just the name of the podcast. And it's literally a 1-page download for getting started on their core values. So if you want to know what makes you tick and how you can actually play to your own strengths, that's going to do it for you. And there's plenty of information in there that will put you in touch with me if you need more help.
Yeah, and for all the audience out there, let's thank Andrea for coming on. I really enjoyed talking with Andrea, and hopefully what she said resonated with the audience. Be sure to check out her socials, give her a follow. And with that, thanks so much for coming on.